Hey, Grace Point family, so excited that we are off to a good start here on our Bible reading plan. I hope that 3 days, this first week of January, has been great for you to get into it a little more easily than having to do a full 5 days. Real quickly, I wanted to draw your attention to the videos that are displayed on the reading app, the reading page that's a part of our website. What you'll notice there are summary videos. I encourage you to use those. You'll see one for the Bible books that you're reading at that time. So in this case, Genesis and Proverbs. This coming week, you're going to see for Genesis and for Job and for Proverbs. And once you've watched one of those, for Proverbs, for example, you don't need to watch it every day. You can just watch it once. It's a summary and overview of the book, and it will help you understand better what it is you're reading when you get to all these new books. So those are there available for you. In this last week, our reading was really cool. We got to read the creation account. And by the way, I encourage you to take all of that as literal history, that the way it's described is the way it happened. Jesus himself speaks of Adam and Eve as real people. He speaks of them not as these figures that some higher scholars or theologians might tell you. They're just analogies. They're just mythical people for the sake of humanity. No, Jesus speaks of them, and the Apostle Paul speaks of them as real people upon whom their theology is based. So I encourage you to look at Genesis that way. You also got into the section about the flood and the reasons for the flood. In particular, at the beginning of chapter 6, it talks about the increasing corruption that's happening on the earth. And it mentions these characters called Nephilim. They're kind of a strange character in the biblical story. You don't quite get who they are. It describes them as sons of God who came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, and they were mighty men of old. These Nephilim, many theologians believe it or not, are angelic beings of some sort, spirit beings of some sort. Some people would call them watchers, which comes from some extra biblical descriptions of things. But these characters are thought to have come in and actually had sexual relationship with human beings, and it created these giant people. Some would say Goliath was from that race. That's one interpretation. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that interpretation, although there's not much in the text to tell us yes or no whether that's true. Others would take that phrase sons of God to refer to the offspring of Seth, the righteous descendant of Adam, rather than Cain, the unrighteous descendant. But to me, that explanation doesn't really explain why you get these mighty men as a result in their offspring. So it's one of those passages that is honestly quite confusing, to be honest with you. There's a lot more there, I'm sure, that we could find if we study the Old Testament, but you got to pick and choose the things you're going to study real closely. That's not one I've done. So if you get into that and you find some interesting stuff, I would love to hear from you. You also got into the flood with Noah and all of the account of how that came about. Noah building the ark, Noah bringing in the animals, actually God bringing in the animals. And when it comes to this issue of the flood, I would encourage you to check out a series of videos you can find both on YouTube and on Amazon Prime called Is Genesis History? And in this, a guy named Del Tackett, he interviews all kinds of geologists and people like that who show the evidence for, in fact, a worldwide flood in the archaeological record. It's amazing to watch and amazing to hear the level of detail to which these scientists have gone to find if the answers are true, that Genesis is history. And a little spoiler, they conclude it is. And they have very, very powerful scientific evidence to show why. So I encourage you to look at those if you have time. Now that was Genesis. We also got into Proverbs for the first 3 days. I hope you're enjoying Proverbs. The wisdom literature of Proverbs is just going to be so powerful for us. So continue reading day by day through the book of Proverbs. Now, looking toward this next week, Genesis 8, the flood subsides and Noah and his family come out. You're going to see this covenant God develops with Noah, where God makes a promise to him about his ancestors and the things that are to come about on the earth. This is where permission is given to mankind to eat the animals for the first time. So prior to that, everybody seems to have been vegan or vegetarian. And afterward, they're able to eat the animals. God gives them that ability. And then Noah's descendants we're going to hear about, and what's called the Table of Nations in chapter 10. And interestingly, from a biological and genealogical standpoint, you could trace back every ethnic group in the world and throughout all history back to this Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10. It's really amazing. Then in chapter 11, we're going to get into the Tower of Babel. You know the story. These people who are building this tower up to heaven, they want to reach God, it says. And what was going on there is a very similar thing that we see in cultures all around the world. We see it in South America. We see it over in Asia and parts of Eastern Asia, where people built ziggurats or towers of some sort, and they typically are temples. These are places of worship. And so it's based around this idea that there is a regional deity in the area, and they're wanting to call that deity to come and reside in that temple. And so they're building a fancy temple. There's a root of pride to this in the Babel situation, and we see God address that. And as a result of God's discipline on them, he frustrates their languages, so it sounds like everyone had a common language up to that point. And here is the origin of different languages and dialects, and they can't understand each other. And so their work is destroyed, or at least the effectiveness of it, and they're scattered all over the world. You're going to see after that the descendants of Shem, which is one of Noah's sons, and then the descendants of Terah. Now, if that name doesn't ring a bell, his son's name definitely will ring a bell. His name is Abram. We're going to get into the story of Abraham right after that. Okay, and you're also going to begin reading the book of Job. Job is one of the oldest books in the Bible, and that's why it's inserted here in our chronological order. Job, it's unclear exactly who he was, but he's a man who feared God, and he's a man who was very wealthy, blessed by God in that way. Now, what the devil's going to say to God is if you allow Job to suffer, he's going to reject you. And that is the whole premise of the book. And so God allows this little dare, this little bet, so to speak, to happen. Now, some things you're going to notice. God is in control the whole time. He's the one who sets the limits on Satan's power. He's the one who allows Satan to do the things that he's doing. So the devil has to get God's permission, so to speak, for the things that he does. That's a real comfort to us as believers. What you're also going to notice is that when all these bad things begin to happen to Job, Job remains faithful. He is not going to betray his God. But getting into chapter 3, Job begins expressing his disappointment with what's happened to him. He begins asking all kinds of questions. He even begins challenging God to come and answer him. Why is this happening? That sounds very familiar, doesn't it? We ask those kinds of questions all the time. And then before you're done with your reading this week, you're going to see Job's friends also show up. A guy named Eliphaz, you're going to see him give a couple of chapters, and then Job's going to reply to him. And I want to caution you as you read the book of Job, be careful of the advice of Job's friends. Eliphaz and Bildad, I believe, are the ones you're going to hear about from this time. And they are coming at Job with false theological beliefs. Beliefs that say, if you didn't do wrong, God would not have allowed bad to come into your happen. So you must have done something wrong. You see, that's their whole premise. And the book of Job is written in part to answer that kind of false theology. You're also going to hear from a guy named Zophar, another one of the friends. These guys, every time you see their names in the passage, recognize they are speaking false beliefs. And the strange thing is, sometimes what they're saying will sound right to us as human beings. But God has a deeper purpose, and God has a greater purpose. God is the God over our suffering and over our hardship as well as everything else. So be careful as you read Job to understand Job's friends, at least these first three friends, are not to be trusted. Job's responses to them are what you really need to pay attention to. That's what we have to look forward to this next week. I hope you're enjoying your Bible reading. Let's stick with it, friends. We have got a great opportunity here to grow together as a church in our knowledge and understanding of the Lord's Word. God bless you. Let's talk about this on Sunday when we come together.